Brother Librarian Vulcan of the Exorcists realized he was the last true human aboard the penitent Echo, the moment Captain Theron smiled at him with teeth that did not belong to anything forged in the womb of a mortal species. Teeth too symmetrical, too perfect, too still. They sat in his mouth like ornaments installed rather than grown, as if the thing behind those eyes had sculpted a face out of human remnants and forgotten that smiles were supposed to move. It hit Vulcan instantly like a psychic shock hammered through the demon scars that marked his soul from the chapter's brutal initiation rites. Every exorcist carried those scars. They were the molten, twisted remnants of the demonic essence that had been forcibly ripped from their flesh during the rite of abjuration, the trial that defined them as a chapter. Vulcan had always felt them like faint embers simmering under the surface of his mind, but never before had they burned like this. Not with the oily heat of warp taint or the razor-edged chill of a daemon's whisper. This was something else, something older, something colder, something that tasted like the void between galaxies and the silence that comes after a species takes its last breath. Captain Theron moved with perfect space marine discipline, every motion crisp, exact, unbroken by hesitation or breath. His armor whirred with sanctified hydraulics. His fingers rested on the command throne's armrests with the poise of a veteran commander. Everything looked correct, except the eyes. Theron's pupils had become windows, not metaphors, not the poetic sense of seeing through a man, but literal apertures to something vast and tentacled, observing the material world with patient, ancient hunger. Not the hunger of predators. Predators acted. This was the hunger of inevitability. The hunger of gravity urging a star to collapse. The hunger of extinction watching its next meal walk willingly into its maw. What stared through Theron was not possessing him as a daemon might. It was wearing him. It had hollowed him clean of humanity and pulled him on like a glove made of flesh and memory. Vulcan could not feel Theron's soul anywhere in the warp sheen of the bridge. Not suppressed, not screaming, not tormented, simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. Around the bridge, 17 other souls moved with the same lifeless precision. Helmsman Yakov, the man who had always hummed Vostroyan work hymns during void translations. Enginseer Row 7, whose Auspec's laughter had echoed through the lower decks for decades. Surf Navigator Kellis, who wept every time she stared into the warp. All of them now moved like statues animated by an alien puppeteer, eyes reflecting geometries that did not belong in human biology. "Brother Librarian," Theron said, and the voice was perfect. Exactly correct, exactly human, exactly wrong. It held no distortion, no layered harmonics, no psychic interference. The imitation was flawless. Vulcan felt sweat bead under his armor's gorget. "Why do you hesitate?" the thing asked through Theron. "We have our orders. The War Master requires all available vessels at the Cadian Gate." Vulcan's blood froze. The War Master. That title had not been used since the days of Solar Command briefings older than Gilliman's living memory. The Great Rift had torn reality 3 years ago, and Gilliman had accepted the mantle of Lord Commander. But War Master? No one called him that now. The thing using Theron must have scavenged the term from fragmented memories understanding the words, but not the time in which they belonged. "Of course, my lord," Vulcan said carefully. "I was merely reviewing the latest astropathic communiques." Theron's smile widened by exactly 1 millimeter. Not 2, not a curve. Exactly 1. That will not be necessary. The astropaths are attending to priority transmissions. The astropaths. 6 aboard Penitent Echo. 6 blind psykers who sang their souls raw, sending messages through the warp. If the entities had taken them first, and they always took psykers first, then every astropathic message the Penitent Echo had sent in the last hours would be infected. Every receiving ship compromised. Every relay node turned into a breeding ground. Vulcan unfurled his witch sight and nearly staggered. The psychic landscape of the frigate did not resemble a ship full of souls. It resembled a dead reef, hollow shells of life covered by parasitic growth. Normally, a ship was a constellation of living spark souls tethered by threads of loyalty, discipline, fear, pride. The penitent echo's souls were still present, but buried, encased, sealed beneath smooth domes of alien thought that reflected no warp presence whatsoever. Daemons lived in the warp. These things did not. They were outside the warp, pressing inward like hands against membrane. "Brother Librarian," Theron said, "your biometrics indicate elevated stress responses. Do you require Medicae attention?" A test. Every pair of puppet eyes on the bridge turned to him with synchronized unity. They were measuring him, evaluating his immunity, determining whether he was threat or specimen. "I am well, Captain," he said, "merely concerned about our navigator. She sealed her chamber before translation and has not responded to Vox requests." "The navigator is resting," Theron replied. "She will emerge when required." A lie. Not because the captain's voice wavered, nothing it said ever wavered, but because Vulcan felt the lie's chill. The navigator had sealed herself because she had seen something that had cracked her mind. "Return to your quarters," Theron said. "Meditate on the Emperor's glory. We will require your psychic talents at the Cadian Gate." They wanted him alive. They wanted him functional. They wanted to study him. Vulcan saluted and walked out, feeling their borrowed eyes track him until the blast doors sealed. The corridor outside was silent, except for the hum of generators and the faint metallic click of bootsteps that weren't following him but listening. The penitent echo's corridors were wrong. Not visibly, not physically, but spiritually. The incense smoke was thicker, heavy, oily. The hymns playing through the Vox speakers had layered harmonics beneath them, frequencies that grated against his daemon scars like rusted knives. These corridors had carried him through battle, through triumph, through years of routine. Now they felt like the veins of a creature wearing a starship's skin. He passed 3 serfs. All 3 smiled. The same smile. 2 white teeth. 2 symmetrical. 2 patient. They did not blink. Vulcan quickened his pace. The astropathic choir's blast door bore deep scratches, gouges carved by hands, or claws, or appendages that did not obey human anatomy. The patterns resembled words, but not ones any human mouth could form. His witch sight translated them automatically. Coordinates. 6 sets. 6 astropaths. They had carved their own locations into the metal like map markers for predators. Vulcan pressed his palm to the access panel. The door unsealed with a groan. The smell that washed over him was wrong. Ozone, copper, necrotic ocean-deep pressure, and something else, something that had no sensory analog in mortal physiology. The 6 blind psykers sat where they always sat, but not as they always sat. Their heads were tilted back at snapping angles, their mouths open in silent screams, their spines arched as if something inside them were pulling upward. Above each floated something that defied geometry, tentacled, vast, flickering between states of matter and pure conceptual form. They were simultaneously too large and too small for the room they occupied, shifting between dimensions, sliding through angles that should not exist. Their limbs phased in and out of the astropath skulls, rooting into their brains like parasitic branches growing downward from a higher plane. One of the astropaths, Selene, turned her eyeless face toward him. Her mouth moved, but the voice wasn't hers. Brother Librarian Vulcan Kane, born Titus Vulcan of Hive Armageddon, the thing said through her. Initiated into the Exorcist's chapter in 957, M41. Survived possession by the daemon Rakthor Gul for 17 minutes. You are catalogued. You are understood. You will serve. What are you? Vulcan whispered. The 6 astropaths answered in perfect unison. We are the Enslavers. The temperature dropped. Vulcan's hearts hammered. We are the hunger that ended the war in heaven, they continued. We are the predators that consumed the old ones. We are the plague that broke the Necrontier. We are the reason the Aeldari fled into their craft worlds. We are the consequence of psychic evolution. The voices held no pride, only certainty. We were defeated once, sealed away beyond the boundaries of your dimension, but your kind has torn reality open again. The great rift bleeds. The Astronomican burns brighter than any beacon since the war in heaven. It calls to us. It feeds us. Vulcan's fingers curled around his bolt pistol. You're spreading through the astropathic network, he said, using them as vectors. Correct. The word was calm, unhurried, absolutely confident. Every astropathic transmission now carries our essence. Every navigator who looks into the Astronomican sees us waiting. Every librarian who opens their witch site feels us watching. Your Imperium painted targets on every psyker in its service, and we have returned to harvest. Vulcan's mind raced. He could not save the ship. He could not warn the Imperium using any channel they controlled. He had one chance. Find the navigator. Find Kellis. She might still be alive. We cannot take you, the Enslavers said. Your demon scars recognize us as Prime's predators older than the demons who wounded you. We cannot breach the patterns etched into your soul. Vulcan stepped back. But we can take everyone around you, they said, and we will make you watch. Vulcan fired. The bolt round detonated in a blast of ceramite-shattering force, but the explosion curved. It bent. It slid harmlessly around the nexus of alien matter, as though reality itself refused to strike the thing occupying it. Not warp spawn. Something older. Something outside the warp. Something the warp feared. Vulcan didn't waste another second. He ran. Vulcan sprinted through the corridors of the penitent echo, his armor thundering against the deck. Warning glyphs flashed across his retinal display, tracking elevated heart rate, adrenal spikes, psychic stress, contamination warning systems reacting to a threat they were not designed to quantify. Behind him, the astropathic doors slid shut with a final, resonant clang, sealing in 6 bodies that no longer belonged to humanity. The ship felt alive around him, not alive like a machine spirit humming with loyalty and purpose, but alive like a carcass animated by parasites. The air recyclers exhaled breaths too slow. The lights dimmed and brightened in pulses that matched no mechanical rhythm. The walls vibrated faintly, as if the bulkheads were listening. Every few corridors, a possessed crewman would stand perfectly still, head tilted slightly, as though waiting for a signal. When Vulcan approached, they would turn in perfect unison, tracking him not with curiosity, but with the mechanical acknowledgement of a tool registering a moving object. He did not strike them unless he had to. The ship needed to remain flyable. More importantly, he needed to conserve his strength for the thing that awaited him near the navigator's spire. The daemon scars burned colder now, sharper, not in warning but in recognition. They knew these creatures, not personally but instinctively. They knew a predator older than demons, older than the warp, a predator the demons themselves had once fled. Vulcan vaulted a fallen servitor, its spinal augmetics twitching as though still receiving commands from a master no longer present. Sparks arced across the deck. The lights flickered, revealing reflections in the steel that were not reflections, angles that twisted when he blinked, shapes that stalked him from impossible corners. He reached the central lift doors, stuck half open, jammed from inside with some kind of bone-like growth. He pried them apart with his gauntlets and stepped inside. The lift quivered, almost as if aware of him. "Bridge level override," he commanded. Nothing. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and whispered a low psychic charge into the command sigil. The machine spirit stirred reluctantly, shuddering against an external influence that clearly hated to relinquish control. The lift began to rise, slowly, painfully, as if hauling itself through sludge. Halfway up, it stopped. Vulcan drew his force sword instantly, senses screaming. A figure crawled into view through the ventilation shaft above the lift. No, not crawled, flowed. A serf, limbs bending wrong, joints twisting 90 degrees further than biology allowed. Her head hung upside down through the shaft opening, face expressionless but eyes filled with shimmering fractals that pulsed like microscopic organisms. "Brother Librarian Vulcan," she whispered, voice too calm for the way her neck dangled, vertebrae visibly out of place. "Do not resist. You cannot resist. We are inevitable." Her jaw unhinged with a sickening crack as she dropped into the lift. Vulcan reacted first. His force sword cleaved her in a vertical stroke, bisecting torso and skull, but instead of blood, a ripple of translucent substance evaporated from the wound like a parasite fleeing a collapsing host. The woman's body fell apart, slack, once again merely human. The lift lurched, then resumed rising. Vulcan exhaled slowly. "Emperor, guide me." When the lift reached Deck 7, the doors slid open with a groan. The corridor outside was empty, eerily so. No possessed serfs, no servitors, no crew. Too quiet. "Kellis," he whispered over the vox, knowing she wouldn't answer unless absolutely safe. "Hold on." He moved low and fast, hugging the wall, senses wide open. The navigator's spire was ahead, a reinforced adamantium door covered in wards etched deep enough to reveal the glittering silver core beneath the plating. The symbols glowed faintly, reacting to Vulcan's approach, and then he heard it, a sound like wet cloth scraping bone, something dragging itself down the hallway behind him. He turned. A single astropath staggered into view, his body broken, limbs twisted, eyes rolled back. But it wasn't the astropath that terrified Vulcan. It was the shadow behind him, a silhouette that rippled across the deck like spilled ink sliding uphill. It reached for the astropath's spine and puppeteered him upright. The body jerked in an unnatural imitation of life. The astropath's head snapped into alignment, vertebrae cracking like snapped twigs. "Return to the bridge, brother librarian," it said in 3 overlapping tones. "This vessel no longer requires your intervention." Vulcan raised his sword. The thing tilted its head precisely 17 degrees, as if calculated. "You cannot harm us. We are beyond your—" Vulcan lunged. He didn't aim for the body. He aimed for the shadow. His sword struck the deck and a burst of psychic force exploded outward. The shadow convulsed, flaring into visible form, a multi-limbed creature made of filaments and angles, its body constantly shifting. It recoiled. Vulcan slashed again. The creature liquefied, melting back into the astropath, snapping spine and skull on the way out. The body collapsed in a heap. Vulcan didn't wait. He reached the navigator's door and slammed his fist against the wards. "Kellis, it's Vulcan, you're still alive. The ship is gone. Only you and I remain." Silence. Then, faintly, "Brother librarian?" He pressed close to the door. "Open it, now." Locks cycled. Chains retracted. The door creaked open by inches. A trembling hand grabbed him and pulled him inside. Kellis sealed the door behind them, breathing hard. The sanctum was dark except for the star chart hololiths floating above her navigation pedestal. She stood pale and shaking, her third eye covered by a band of cracked adamantium etched with wards. "What happened?" she whispered. "I saw things. When we translated into the system, they were waiting in the Astronomican's light." Vulcan steadied her. "The ship is compromised. The Enslavers have returned." She recoiled, nearly collapsing. No, that's impossible. They were sealed away during the war in heaven. "The Great Rift tore those seals open," he said, "and the Astronomican is feeding them." Kellis covered her mouth. "They're feeding on the Emperor," she whispered. "On the beacon itself." Vulcan nodded grimly. "We need to get off this ship, or take control of it, or destroy it, but we cannot let them reach another vessel." She lowered her trembling hands. "I can navigate manually, without the Astronomican, but it will take time. And while you calculate it," Vulcan said, "we need to reclaim the bridge." Kellis swallowed hard. "They'll be waiting." "I know." Vulcan raised his sword. "And I'm done running." Vulcan moved first, pushing open the sanctum door while Kellis stayed behind him, clutching her las pistol with both shaking hands. The corridor outside was empty again, too empty. The emptiness felt intentional, curated, as though the Enslavers had withdrawn their puppets to give him space, or to lure him forward. They wanted him to reach the bridge. They wanted him to bring them to the Necrons. Vulcan's jaw clenched. He wasn't blind to the manipulation, but he also wasn't about to abandon his only path toward warning the Imperium. If the Enslavers thought they could control the board, Vulcan resolved to be the piece they could not predict. He advanced down the hall with deliberate steps, his force sword glowing faintly, leaving a thin trail of blue-white sparks against the dimness. Every motion echoed strangely, as though the ship's corridors had become longer, stretched across angles that didn't exist. Kellis followed at a safe distance, head lowered, avoiding eye contact with every reflective surface. She had learned quickly what Vulcan already suspected. The Enslavers were watching through more than eyes. They were observing through reflections, shadows, patterns of sound, anything that resonated between dimensions. The first obstacle came quietly. A group of 6 crewmen stood motionless in the intersection, arranged in perfect symmetry, 3 on each side, hands clasped behind their backs. Their eyes glimmered with geometric reflections. Vulcan slowed. They didn't attack. They simply waited. Kellis whispered, "They're studying us." Vulcan nodded. "Then let them study." One of the serfs stepped forward, moving with such fluid grace it appeared as though gravity had stopped applying to him. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly modulated. "Brother Librarian, your resistance is inefficient. Your efforts to reclaim the vessel will fail. We have already integrated the majority of its systems." Vulcan raised his sword. "Move." The serf tilted his head, eyes shimmering in fractal spirals. "Your weapon is irrelevant. The host bodies are irrelevant. We are here to observe you, to understand why you alone cannot be assimilated." Vulcan stepped closer, forcing the serf to look up at him. "You won't find the answer." "We already have," the Enslaver replied through the serf. "You were claimed once by the Imperium, and the Imperium leaves scars, wounds that warp the soul, echoes that reject rivals." "No," Vulcan said quietly. "It's not rejection." His sword flashed. The serf's head fell before his body knew it was dead. "It's survival." The other 5 serfs lunged in perfect synchronization, their motions impossibly fluid, as if their bones had become rope and their joints were made of oil. Vulcan pivoted, letting the first 2 strike empty space, while his blade carved a smoking arc through the next pair. Kellis fired her last pistol behind him, vaporizing one attacker just as its fingers stretched toward Vulcan's exposed flank, nails elongating like sharpened wire. When the last puppet collapsed, the Enslaver essence drifted free, visible for a moment, as shimmering strands before melting back into the walls. Kellis caught her breath, trembling. "Vulcan, they're not trying to kill you. I know." He wiped the blade clean, though the blood evaporated even before it touched the deck. "They want me intact. They want to learn. And once they learn, then they'll adapt." A new urgency tightened his muscles. If the Enslavers learned how to bypass Damon's scars, if they learned how to breach the souls of the exorcists, it would not just be the Imperium at risk. It would be the galaxy. They moved deeper into the ship, approaching the armored blast doors of the bridge. This time, the doors were open, inviting him in. Vulcan stepped through. The bridge glowed with diffuse, unnatural light. The hololithic maps flickered with images that were not from this ship, snapshots of distant stars, impossible constellations, glimpses of places outside reality. Crew members occupied their stations, sitting in perfect postures, awaiting commands not from a captain but from a parasitic intelligence wearing him like a puppet. Captain Theron sat in the command throne exactly as Vulcan had left him, hands steepled, posture immaculate. His eyes shone with the same alien images the others displayed. "Brother Librarian," he greeted. "You return, as predicted." Vulcan leveled his sword. "And I will end you, as promised." Theron smiled. "You misunderstand. This body is irrelevant. Its destruction is irrelevant. What matters is the outcome of your actions." The bridge crew stood as one, their voices blended into a single chord. "You will take us to the Necrons." Vulcan's grip tightened. Theron leaned forward slightly, puppet muscles shifting like fabric over empty space. "And you will do so because you see no alternative." Vulcan's knuckles strained against his gauntlets. "If I bring you to them," Vulcan said, "they'll tear you apart." "Yes," Theron replied. "That is the point." Kellis stepped forward, horrified. You want the Necrons to attack you? We want information, the Enslaver said through Theron. Knowledge. Weapons designed to wound entities like us. The Necrons are the only species that developed such things. If they attack us, they reveal their defenses. Vulcan's heart sank. They weren't afraid of the Necrons. They were hunting the Necrons and using him as bait. No worse. As a translator, they needed him to bridge the gap between human technology and Necron architecture. They needed someone immune to their influence to operate inside null fields where they couldn't exist. He realized the truth with cold certainty. They can't enter Necron spaces, Vulcan whispered. Theron nodded. Correct. Necron null fields reject us utterly. Their pylons sever our dimensional anchors. We cannot study their structures directly. We require an agent who can. Vulcan's throat tightened. They want me to gather the data for them, he breathed. Yes, the Enslavers replied through every voice in the room. You will walk where we cannot. You will access what we cannot reach. And then deliver it to you, Vulcan said bitterly. Correct. Vulcan inhaled, steadying himself. And if I refuse? Theron's pupils expanded into spirals of shifting geometry. Then we will explore your mind until we understand what makes you immune. And once we replicate your immunity, your species will fall in days instead of months. Kellis took a step back, trembling. Vulcan made his decision. He lowered his sword not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. We're going to that tomb world. Theron nodded. We knew you would. But understand this, Vulcan said softly. When we get there, you will not get what you want. Theron smiled, skin stretching unnaturally. We already have what we want. Vulcan frowned. And what's that? You. A cold dread crawled up his spine. Before he could react, every crew member spoke at once, in perfect harmony. You are our key. Vulcan lunged. His blade cut through 3 host bodies before anyone could blink. Kellis opened fire, her las pistol ripping holes through skulls and chests. Puppets fell. Limbs flew. Voices screamed in layered harmonics. But as the hosts died, the Enslaver essence streamed upward not toward escape, but toward the hololithic map glowing on the bridge. The map flickered, formed into a star chart, then into coordinates. Coordinates plotted directly into the ship's navigation system. The Enslavers didn't need the hosts anymore. They had already set the course. Vulcan reached the command throne, grabbed the captain's lifeless body, and tore him free from the throne's interfaces. As Theron's corpse slumped to the deck, the hololith shifted again. 6 words appeared across its entire surface. You will guide us there. Vulcan's stomach dropped. The ship's engines rumbled to life. Reality thinned. Kellis screamed. They're initiating warp translation. Vulcan slammed his fist into the navigation console. Cancel translation. But it was too late. The penitent echo tore itself into the Imperium, driven by an intelligence that existed both inside and outside the warp, and plotted a direct course toward the dead world of Sotek. The ship shuddered. The lights flickered. The hull groaned like a creature waking from nightmare. Vulcan felt the warp twist around them. The Enslavers did not need permission anymore. They needed only momentum. Kellis gripped the console, voice trembling. Vulcan, what do we do? He stared at the star charts. At the dead world waiting for them. At the trap he now stood inside. We survive, Vulcan said. Long enough to burn them out of creation. The warp swallowed the penitent echo whole. This translation was different. Vulcan felt it immediately. Normally, the Imperium pressed against a vessel like a storm, chaotic, shifting, violent. But now the warp recoiled. Not from the ship, but from whatever rode inside it. The Enslavers moved through the Imperium like apex predators, wandering through a field of prey that knew instinctively to stay silent. Vulcan steadied himself against a railing as the deck lurched. The lights flickered as though reality were debating whether to illuminate the vessel or let it drift unnoticed into nothingness. Kellis knelt beside a console, gripping it tightly, her breathing ragged and uneven. There, everywhere, she whispered. I can feel them pressing against the wards. They're circling the ship like sharks. Vulcan closed his eyes briefly. Focus. Your fear is what they want. They don't need fear, she said. They're trying to read through me. They're learning my thoughts in reverse, reading the psychic residue of every warp translation I've ever done. They're mapping how human navigators think. And adapting, Vulcan finished grimly. Kellis nodded. Yes. They're learning how to predict our movements through the warp. If they can do that, they won't need human navigators at all. Vulcan considered that terrifying truth. Human navigators had evolved to survive the warp through the Emperor's gift, a psychic mutation that let them perceive the tides of chaos. If the Enslavers learned that perception even partially, they could navigate the warp with precision that would make Imperial travel obsolete. Every ship in the galaxy would be at their mercy. The deck shuddered. A sound like breaking glass reverberated through the corridors. Then another. Vulcan's helmet auto-senses identified the source instantly. Warp-thin zones, he said. The barriers are collapsing. Something is breaching reality. Kellis shook her head violently. Not something. Them. They're forcing dimensional fractures so they can manifest physically when we reach the tomb world. They can't exist inside a full null field, but they're preparing ways to bypass it. They're trying to anchor themselves. Vulcan swore under his breath. We don't have much time. He moved to the central hololithic display. The ship's trajectory appeared as an elegant arc of light cutting across a storm of shifting psychic currents. Every few seconds, the trajectory flickered, altered by the Enslavers, adjusting their course with micro-precision far beyond any human navigator's ability. They were steering the penitent Echo perfectly. Too perfectly. Vulcan frowned. This isn't a standard translation path. It's a predatory one, Kellis whispered. They're avoiding every warp creature strong enough to slow them down and moving toward anything that feeds on psionic residue. They're baiting the warp itself, feeding the natural predators with scraps of psychic signal to keep them appeased. In other words, Vulcan said, they're clearing the route. For us, Kellis corrected. No correction, for themselves. Vulcan's stomach tightened. The Enslavers were not only steering them with precision, they were reshaping the warp's behavior around the ship, adjusting currents, quieting storms, nudging entities out of their path with microscopic pulses of psychic pressure. This was not a simple infestation. This was strategy. The Enslavers weren't random horrors, they were an intelligence coordinating itself across thousands of dimensions, through millions of borrowed minds. They were planning something. Vulcan didn't have long to think about it. A klaxon sounded. The warp outside erupted with blinding color. Then a voice echoed through the entire ship, not through vox, but through raw psychic pressure. A voice both vast and whisper-soft. A voice like a choir humming through bone. You approach the pylon world, Kellis cried out, clutching her head. Vulcan felt the psychic resonance scraping against his daemon scars like claws on glass. The Enslavers were speaking directly through the warp, not through hosts. Brace yourself, Vulcan warned. The ship lurched again. Then, slowly, the warp receded. Not because the ship was translating, but because something was pushing the warp away. Vulcan felt the shift before the alarms registered it. A softening, a thinning, a numbing pressure. The ship was entering a null zone. Kellis gasped. The pylons, they're active already. Vulcan moved to her side. You see them? I see the shadows of them, she said, pressing her palms to her temples. There are dozens, hundreds, all arranged around the planet like a lattice, a cage. Their null field overlaps so strongly that the warp above the world is almost gone. A new alarm blared. Real space translation imminent. Vulcan braced himself. Hold on. The ship tore free of the warp. For a moment, there was silence. Then the void lit up. Pylons rose from the tomb world's surface like mountains of solid, obsidian black metal. Green energy arced between them, building vast geometric networks that spanned kilometers. The ship's sensors flickered and spat error runes. The null field. It's destabilizing our systems, Kellis said. Everything is running raw. Vulcan nodded. Good. That means the Enslavers can't touch us inside this zone. Kellis gave him a haunted look. That's not entirely true. Vulcan turned sharply. Explain. They're retreating from the pylons. Yes, but they haven't abandoned the ship. They've condensed themselves, pulled their essence into tighter anchor points. Vulcan felt his daemon scars burn again. Where? He demanded. Kellis pointed shakily at the deck beneath them. Below us, deep inside the ship, they're forming a core, a nexus, a compacted mass of their essence. They're trying to hide it from the pylon's pull. Vulcan's blood ran cold. They're anchoring themselves to our ship. Yes, Kellis whispered. If we land, they'll be inside the null zone with us, protected by the ship's machine spirit. Vulcan then understood the true danger. The Enslavers didn't need to bypass the pylons. They just needed to hitch a ride inside a vessel whose machine spirit could shield them, even partially, from null energy. If they entered the tomb world's interior even once, the Necrons would be the ones caught off guard, not the Enslavers. Vulcan grabbed Kellis by the shoulder. Can you land us manually? Maybe. But why land at all? Why not stay orbit side? Because if we stay in orbit, the Enslavers will eventually reconstitute themselves and seize the ship again, and the pylons won't protect us from inside the vessel not once they reassert control. Kellis swallowed hard. So we need to reach the surface. Yes. Even if it means dragging them with us? Vulcan exhaled. Yes. He opened a shipwide Vox channel. This is Brother Librarian Vulcan Kaine. All surviving crew, report to secured chambers. Prepare for hard landing. This vessel is compromised. I repeat, the ship is compromised. The Vox crackled with confused voices. Vulcan didn't wait for replies. He turned to Kellis. Strap in. Take us down. Kellis nodded and moved to the pilot's controls. Vulcan took one step toward the main console, and the deck plates exploded. Something massive and tentacled burst upward from the lower decks, tearing through steel with casual indifference. The creature was barely visible, a ripple of translucent geometry, a shifting mass of angles and fractal limbs. It wasn't fully real. It wasn't fully here. But its appendages tore reality like wet cloth. Kellis screamed. Vulcan raised his sword. No, he thought suddenly. It wasn't attacking them. It was anchoring itself. The creature wrapped its limbs around the bridge supports, around the command throne, around the ceiling struts, embedding itself into the ship's architecture like a parasite burrowing into bone. It was fusing itself with the ship. Vulcan struck. His blade passed through the creature's limb, but not entirely. Part of the limb splintered like glass, but the rest phased into another dimension. The creature recoiled, but it did not retreat. Kellis shouted, "It's trying to reinforce the hull. Vulcan, if it merges fully, the pylon's null field won't affect it." Vulcan realized the true purpose. The Enslaver wasn't trying to survive the landing. It was trying to survive the pylons. If even one Enslaver was able to anchor itself in the material world, inside a vessel shielded by a machine spirit, it could become a seed, a beachhead, a new invasion point the Necrons would never anticipate. Vulcan slashed again, pouring psychic force into his blade until the air crackled with pale blue lightning. This time, the creature screamed. The sound made the bridge lights burst. Kellis grabbed the controls. "Vulcan, the ship is descending whether we want it to or not." He had no time. Vulcan threw his entire psychic strength into a single attack, channeling every lesson of the Exorcist's brutal trials, every fragment of strength carved into him by daemon scarification. He struck the creature's central mass. Reality cracked. The Enslaver shuddered. Then its form shattered fragments, scattering like broken glass between dimensions. Kellis gasped. "It's gone." "No," Vulcan said. "Only injured. Only unfocused. It'll reform if we don't land now." Kellis gripped the controls. "Brace yourself." The penitent echo plunged toward the tomb world's surface. The pylons glowed brighter. Necron energy surged upward. The ship's hull groaned and screamed as reality hardened around it. Vulcan felt the Enslaver's final shriek ripple through the warp, an alien cry of anger, hunger, and something eerily close to fear. Then the ship hit atmosphere. Flames ignited across the hull. The ground rushed upward. Vulcan gripped his sword. Kellis screamed something he couldn't hear, and the penitent echo slammed toward the surface of the dead world, carrying the last hope of humanity and the last desperate fragments of an ancient, all-consuming nightmare. For a moment, the warp went silent. Not calm, not peaceful. Silent like a predator inhaling before it lunges. Vulcan felt the temperature in the bridge plummet. Frost ran across the view screens, crawling over the consoles like veins of dead light. The hololithic display flickered, showing not navigational runes but blurred shapes writhing behind the pixels. The air grew thick enough to taste like copper, ozone, and something older, something that reminded Vulcan of the void outside galaxies, where even chaos refused to dwell. Then the whispering began, not through vox, not through the warp, not through sound, through thought. A multitude of voices not aligned, not unified, but layered, pressed against the edges of Vulcan's consciousness, like fingertips testing the walls of a locked room. Not enough. Not enough. Not enough. Each whisper frayed like torn cloth, as if billions of beings were speaking from distances where physics no longer applied. Kellis clutched her head, staggering back as her third eye convulsed behind its lid. They're pushing. Vulcan, they're pushing reality from the outside. They want back in. They want everything back. Vulcan steadied her as the lights dimmed again. The pylons suppressed the ones already in the material. But the ones outside, they're gathering, she whispered, massing around the breach. They were feeding on the Astronomican from the warp side. But the pylon drove them out. It cut the flow. Her voice cracked. Now they're starving. Starving entities older than chaos, clawing for entry into a galaxy built of psykers they could hollow and wear like ritual masks. The hull screamed. Metal. Actual metal crying out like tortured bone. Vulcan spun toward the viewport. The void outside had curdled into something wrong, colors spiraling through geometric patterns no mortal brain was meant to interpret. The ship wasn't under attack, it was being studied, dissected with senses that did not rely on eyes or touch. And then something pressed against the Geller field. Not physically, psychically. Like a trillion-ton shadow made of hunger leaned its weight against the barrier of reality and tested the seams. The Geller field rippled, buckled, nearly snapped. Kellis screamed again. They're trying to pry us open like a seed pod. Alarms blared. Runes turned black. The Enslavers were no longer content to wait. They were forcing themselves through the cracks, bypassing the pylon's effect by sheer mass of numbers. Kellis, Vulcan said, pulling her back from the viewport. Activate emergency translation. Get us out of here. Anywhere. Kellis nodded with trembling hands, but her third eye flicked open, involuntarily bleeding warp light. She froze. Vulcan grabbed her shoulders. Kellis. She blinked as if waking from a nightmare. Vulcan, I saw terror, she whispered. Her voice was ash. I saw the throne world. The Astronomican is flickering. Something is attacking it, not from the warp, she swallowed. From reality, like a shadow cast by something that isn't here yet. Vulcan's hearts trembled. Are the Enslavers already there? No. Kellis wiped blood from her nose. Worse. They're closing in. But not in ships, not in warp flows. They're merging around Terra like a gravitational well. Vulcan felt the cold certainty settling inside him. The Enslavers were gathering to devour the Emperor. Not the Imperium. Not psykers. Not the beacon. The Emperor himself. The one mind in the galaxy vast enough to feed 1,000,000 Enslaver broods for 1,000,000 years. A mind older than the Astronomican. Older than the Imperium. Old enough that its light could sustain an entire species of hunger. Vulcan turned to the crew. Many were waking, confused, lost. Some crying, some praying, some staring blankly at their hands, whispering names of loved ones, as if relearning what it meant to have a soul. Listen to me, Vulcan roared, and the bridge froze. You were possessed. Your minds were sealed away. You weren't corrupted, you were stored. The Necrons drove the parasites out, but they're coming back. And this time they're coming for terror. Fear rippled across the deck. Kellis placed a shaking hand on the navigation console. We can make the jump, but once we do, they'll follow our wake. Then we need to move faster than they can react, Vulcan said. Punch the engines to full. Every second counts. Kellis nodded. And that was when the hull split open. Not breached. Not punctured. Not torn. Unzipped. As if reality itself were a garment and something had tugged the seam apart. A ripple of black light, not shadow, not void, but something deeper raced through the corridor outside the bridge. Crew members screamed as the phenomenon touched them, not killing them, not consuming them, flipping them, turning them inside out in a manner invisible to the eye but catastrophic to the soul. Vulcan ignited his force sword and stepped forward. Kellis, go. She slammed her hand onto the translation rune. The Geller field screamed. The bridge lights blew out. The ship lurched so violently even Vulcan staggered. And then, translation. A violent, catastrophic, prayerless fall into the warp. The penitent echo vanished into the Imperium, but something came with them. Something vast. Something angry. Something starving. And something new. Something the pylons hadn't stopped. Something the Necrons had not expected. Something the Enslavers had become in response to the galaxy resisting their return. The hull groaned again. But this time, the sound came from inside. Vulcan steadied himself as the warp roared around them like an ocean made of nightmares. The Geller field flickered with every second, strained to its limit by the weight of something pressing inward, a presence that moved like a slow tide in every direction at once. Kellis gasped, her eyes wide, her breath fogging in the freezing air of the bridge. Vulcan, she whispered. They're inside the Geller field. What? His heart's clenched. That's impossible. Nothing can. They're not breaching it. They're bypassing it. She pointed upward. They aren't from the warp anymore. And Vulcan suddenly understood. The pylons forced the Enslavers out of the Imperium, so the Enslavers adapted. We didn't push them out, he whispered. We pushed them sideways. Into the places between warp and materium. Into the cracks of physics. Into the dark spaces where the laws of reality were thin and immature. A third domain. One humanity had never named because it had never needed to. Something struck the hull again from inside the walls, and the metal bulged inward like a lung trying to expand. Kellis grabbed Vulcan's arm, her voice trembling. It's not just one entity. It's an entire brood. Hundreds. Thousands. They hitched themselves to our transition vector. Can you throw them off? Vulcan demanded. She shook her head. They're not on the ship. They're in the shadow the ship casts on something that exists behind reality. Vulcan raised his force sword. Then we're fighting things we can't physically touch, he muttered. No, Kellis whispered. We're fighting things that can touch us. The first emerged through the floor. Not by phasing, not by teleportation. It simply unfolded like something blooming into the wrong dimension. It resembled the Enslavers, but stretched, elongated, shimmering with flickers of anti-light. Its limbs bent in arcs that violated Euclidean space, trailing echoes of itself in temporal after-images. It had evolved, no longer bound to the warp, no longer feeding only on psykers. It had adapted to feed on everything. The crew screamed. The being did not move quickly. It didn't need to. It simply reached toward a serf with a tendril that brushed his forehead. The serf went silent, then hollow, then gone, not vanished, not displaced, simply removed, as if reality had deleted him from memory. Kellis's voice broke. Vulcan, they're learning faster than the pylons predicted. Vulcan slashed his force sword through the creature's tendril, cleaving the limb in half. It didn't bleed. It corrected itself. The cut simply reversed, like watching a wound heal in backward time. Vulcan stepped between it and Kellis. Stay behind me. More creatures unfolded through the walls. Dozens. Hundreds. A tide of wrongness. The ship shuddered. The hull bent. The Geller field flickered. Kellis's eyes widened suddenly. Vulcan terror just lit up in the warp. What do you mean? It's flaring. Something massive just awakened. Something is responding to the enslavers closing in. Vulcan felt the truth behind her words. The Emperor, the throne, the Astronomican. Something had changed. Something had awakened. It feels like, Kellis swallowed, like a storm trying to push back the tide. But the tide isn't water, it's hunger. Vulcan's sword hummed with psychic fury as he drove it through the nearest creature, shattering its form long enough to create space. Kellis, we need to reach Terra before the enslavers do. Whatever the Emperor is doing, he's holding them off, but not for long. The ship lurched again, violently. Screams echoed through the corridors. Entities burst from the walls like a plague blooming in reverse. Kellis staggered to her console. We're too far, she whispered. Unless what? Unless we drop out of the warp. Vulcan turned to her, incredulous. Dropping now would tear the ship apart. Staying in will kill us faster. She pointed to the sensor displays, shaking. Vulcan, the Enslaver brood isn't following us to Terra. He froze. Then what are they following? Kellis whispered. You. Vulcan felt cold metal fingers close around his hearts. His daemon scars. His psychic immunity. His soul's unique structure. They wanted him, not to consume, to learn, to adapt, to overcome their one weakness. Kellis slammed her hand down on the emergency control, dropping us out of the warp now. The ship tore back into real space with a shriek that sounded like the death of a god. The entities recoiled in shock. Some evaporated, some fractured, some simply screamed. The Geller field collapsed instantly. The stars flickered back into existence. Sensors crackled with static, and Vulcan saw where they were. Our dead system, a dying star, a graveyard of ancient vessels, fragments of unknown civilizations drifting like bones. And one signal, a repeating beacon, ancient Necron code, but crude, distorted, damaged. Kellis gasped. Vulcan, someone activated a pylon in this system. It's weak, almost dead, but it's pushing the brood back, just barely. Vulcan looked at the shadow creatures writhing at the edges of the bridge. They were afraid. They were being forced to stay partially inside reality, but only barely. We can finish this, Kellis whispered, if we get the pylon reactivated, at full power. Vulcan nodded. It could destroy the entire brood. Kellis looked at him, trembling. But you won't survive activating it. Vulcan tightened his grip on his sword. I know. The creatures screamed. The ship shuddered. The pylon pulsed on the dead world below. Vulcan stepped toward the boarding ramp. For Terra, he whispered. For the Emperor. For humanity. And Kellis whispered back. For all of us. The doors opened. The entities lunged. And Vulcan leapt into the darkness. He fell through a shaft of fractured light, the pylon core burning in his gauntleted hands like a newborn star trying to claw its way out of reality. Gravity dissolved. Orientation vanished. The walls around him were no longer walls, they were planes of dead Necron metal, slick with dimensional bleed, flickering between matter and memory as the containment grid collapsed. Somewhere far below, the Enslaver brood boiled upward in a tidal mass of tendrils and translucent flesh, screaming in harmonics that made his bones rattle. They were coming for him, not the subtle, patient infiltration they had shown before. This was hunger unmasked, an ancient predator revealed in its true shape. Vulcan twisted mid-fall, igniting his force blade. Lightning crawled along its length, the weapon humming with psychic defiance. The daemon scars under his armor pulsed, reacting to the proximity of the Enslaver brood. The scars flared painfully, but not with rejection this time. They flared with recognition. These things were older than the warp, older than chaos, older than the scars themselves. The scars were reacting to something primordial, something buried so deep in the species' memory of the galaxy that it vibrated through creation like an ancient warning. Below him, the brood surged upward, hundreds of them, a choir of translucent horrors layering their voices into a single reality-piercing command. Sir, your end, country. Vulcan answered by stabbing his sword downward, the psychic burn cracking through the shaft as he struck the first creature mid-air. The enslaver shrieked not in pain, but in surprise. It had never felt a weapon forged from a soul, tainted by warp and cleansed by ritual. It convulsed and exploded into shards of thought. Vulcan slammed into a platform of shifting metal, landing in a battle stance. The pylon core pulsed against his palm, resonating with the tomb world's deep architecture. The bridge above was breaking apart. The ship trembled violently as enslavers tore through decks in pursuit. Behind him, Kellis stumbled through the collapsing corridor, coughing, limping, clutching at the wound in her side. Blood dripped from her nose, a sign of warp pressure overload. Vulcan, she gasped. The brood, there's thousands. There only need to be enough for one to reach Terra, Vulcan growled. And they were more than enough. The platform shuddered as 3 enslavers phased onto it. Tendrils of translucent thought lanced forward, trying to burrow into Kellis's skull. Vulcan moved with the speed of a man who had already accepted death. His force blade cut the first creature in half. Psychic lightning scoured the second into ash. The third wrapped tendrils around his arm, burning through ceramite. His scars flared white. The enslaver screamed and recoiled. It could not drink him. It could only taste the memory of the demon that had once possessed him, and it choked on it. More enslavers swarmed through the air. The pylon core throbbed, ready aching to activate. But it needed a catalyst, a psychic surge, a soul. Not Kellis. She was too fragile. Not any human. It required something stronger, something that could endure annihilation long enough to trigger the ignition. Vulcan looked down at the pylon core, then at the enslavers, then at Kellis. Kellis, he said quietly. Go. She stared at him in horror. No, Vulcan, no. This was always going to be a one-way mission. I see it now. The pylon needs a psychic interface strong enough to anchor the ignition. I'm the only one who can survive long enough to finish it. You won't survive at all. Vulcan smiled softly, sadly the smile of a man who had finally found clarity inside damnation. That was never the point. The brood surged forward. Vulcan stepped between Kellis and the swarm, his sword roaring with witchfire. Kellis, he said without turning, you have to make it to Terra. You have to tell them. You're the only navigator who's seen what's coming. She shook her head violently, tears burning down her face. I can't leave you. Yes, he whispered. You can. The enslavers screamed and lunged, and time slowed. Vulcan lifted the pylon core above his head. It lit the chamber like a second sun. The enslavers recoiled instinctively, fear rippling through their collective mind. Vulcan's scars erupted in white flame, psychic filaments lashing outward like wings of cold fire. His soul expanded, stretched, burned. He became the interface. He became the key. He became the ignition. For the Emperor, he roared. He slammed the core into the tomb world's pylon socket. The universe broke. A wave of null energy exploded outward, a detonation that did not kill but erased, ripping the enslavers from every dimension simultaneously. They screamed as their multidimensional bodies collapsed into singularity, then into nothing, their forms unraveling like dying stars. The shockwave tore through the penitent echo, through the tomb world, through the surrounding sector. Silence followed. A terrible, perfect, impossible silence. Kellis lay on the deck, ears bleeding, consciousness fading. Through the haze, she saw Vulcan standing in the center of the dais, still, silent. His armor smoked. His eyes were closed. The aura around him flickered like dying embers. He was alive, but only barely. He turned his head toward her. Not all the way. Just enough. Kellis, he whispered, voice barely audible. Go. She crawled to him. He raised a trembling hand, stopping her. I have to stay, he whispered, to keep the core active, to seal the breach. If I move, even a step, the field collapses. You'll die, she cried. Vulcan smiled a small, exhausted smile. No, I'll endure. For the first time, she understood. He wasn't staying alive for himself. He was staying alive for the galaxy, held in place by force of will, by demon scar, by duty, by love for a species too stubborn to die. She rose, staggering toward the escape pods. "Tell Terra," Vulcan whispered. "The first breach is sealed, but more are coming." She turned. "Tell them," he whispered again, "to prepare." The field brightened. His body dissolved into silhouette. Psychic light poured from his scars like a dying star fighting against collapse. Kellis launched herself into the pod. The doors sealed. The engines fired. As the pod shot into space, she looked back at the tomb world. It glowed like a green sun. In its center, she saw a figure, arms outstretched, holding back the void. Brother Librarian Vulcan Kine. Exorcist. Warrior. Sacrifice. Seal. The last light of humanity on a world of ancient metal. Then the pylon activated fully. A column of blinding energy erupted into the void. The brood was gone. The breach was closed. And Vulcan became the first human being, in 60 million years, to hold back an enslaver incursion alone. He became a landmark in the warp, a warning, a scar, a sentinel. Kellis stumbled out of her escape pod into the docks of Luna, half-starved, half-mad, drenched in warp residue. Imperial guards surrounded her. Custodians approached with weapons drawn. "I have information for Terra," she whispered. "For Gilliman. For the throne." "What is the message?" a custodian demanded. Kellis lifted her head, eyes bloodshot and burning. "Humanity has 6 months," she said hoarsely. "Maybe less." The custodians froze. 6 months until what? Kellis swallowed. "Until the next wave arrives." Silence. Cold. Heavy. "And what of this Vulcan you spoke of?" they asked. She looked toward the stars. "He's still holding them back," she whispered. "But he can't do it forever." A single tear slid down her cheek. "Build the pylons. Gather the psykers. Warn the Emperor. Because Vulcan bought us time. But time is all he bought." The custodians stared at her. And somewhere deep in the warp, a presence flickered faint but unbroken. Vulcan was still fighting. Still burning. Still holding the door shut with his bare soul. Humanity had its warning. Humanity had its chance. Whether it deserved it was up to the Emperor to decide.